Good evening. There was a moment, just before midnight, when two ships moved silently toward one another through a wall of fog. Neither crew believed disaster was only minutes away. On one bridge, officers watched a glowing radar screen, confident they understood what it was telling them. On the other, experienced sailors trusted years spent at sea, believing they had already avoided danger. Between them lay only darkness, damp air, and a misunderstanding so small that it almost seemed impossible. Yet within minutes, steel would tear through steel, hundreds of lives would hang in the balance, and one of the world's most beautiful ocean liners would begin the slow journey to the bottom of the Atlantic. It was not simply a story about a ship sinking. It was a story about confidence, technology, human judgment, and the quiet mistakes that history often remembers far more clearly than the people who made them. Welcome back. If you enjoy these slow journeys into the forgotten corners of history, you might like to settle in by subscribing and returning for more stories like this. And if you feel like joining listeners from around the world, leave a comment with your city and the time where you are listening tonight. There is something comforting about imagining so many people, separated by oceans and continents, all sharing the same quiet walk through the past. Now, let yourself relax. Allow the sounds of the day to fade into the background. Imagine the steady rhythm of waves beneath a great ship, the cool night air over the Atlantic, and the distant call of a ship's whistle somewhere beyond the fog. Tonight, we are sailing back to the summer of 1956, to uncover the story of the wreck of the Andrea Doria and to ask a question that has never completely disappeared. Who was really to blame? To understand that question, we have to step back into a different age of travel. Long before airports connected continents in a matter of hours, crossing the Atlantic was an experience measured not in flights but in days. The ocean itself became part of the journey. Travelers packed carefully, dressed elegantly for dinner, wandered polished decks, read books beneath warm blankets, and watched endless horizons where sea met sky. The voyage was not merely transportation. It was an event. The great passenger liners of the 20th century were floating cities. They carried businessmen, immigrants, diplomats, movie stars, students, families beginning new lives, and tourists seeking adventure. Some ships became famous for their speed. Others earned admiration through luxury or reliability. Nations proudly displayed these vessels as symbols of engineering, craftsmanship, and prestige. Italy had emerged from the devastation of the Second World War with deep wounds. Cities needed rebuilding. Industries struggled to recover. The country's reputation, damaged by war, required something hopeful to represent a brighter future. In that atmosphere, the decision to construct a magnificent new ocean liner carried meaning beyond commerce. The ship would not simply transport passengers. It would carry Italian pride across the Atlantic. Named after the famous Renaissance admiral Andrea Doria, the vessel reflected elegance from bow to stern. Architects and artists collaborated to create interiors unlike almost any other passenger ship afloat. Marble staircases gleamed beneath carefully designed lighting. Paintings and sculptures celebrated Italian culture. Dining rooms shimmered with polished silver and crystal glasses. Cabins combined comfort with understated sophistication. Passengers often spoke of how modern everything felt. Unlike many older liners that still reflected pre-war tastes, Andrea Doria embraced clean lines, bright spaces, and contemporary design. Even those who had traveled aboard famous British or French liners frequently remarked on the ship's unique atmosphere. But beauty was only one part of her identity. She represented confidence in modern engineering. Andrea Doria stretched more than 700 feet in length and displaced thousands of tons. Powerful engines carried her across the Atlantic at impressive speed while advanced navigation equipment promised greater safety than previous generations of ships had enjoyed. Among those improvements was radar. Only a decade earlier, radar had been a military innovation that helped detect aircraft and enemy ships hidden by darkness or weather. By the 1950s, commercial vessels increasingly relied upon it to navigate safely through fog, rain, and nighttime conditions. Mariners still depended on experience, charts, compasses, and visual observation, but radar offered something extraordinary. It could reveal what human eyes could not. That mattered greatly on the North Atlantic. This stretch of ocean had always been unpredictable. Warm currents met cold waters. Dense fog formed without warning. Storms rolled across open seas. Icebergs occasionally drifted farther south than expected. Even during calm weather, visibility could vanish within minutes. For centuries, sailors respected the Atlantic because it refused to be fully mastered. Andrea Doria's designers understood those dangers. They equipped the ship with modern safety features, including watertight compartments intended to help the vessel survive damage. Regulations had evolved significantly since the sinking of Titanic in 1912. Lessons from earlier disasters influenced shipbuilding across the world. Many believe disasters like Titanic belong to history. But history has a habit of reminding people that every generation believes its technology has solved yesterday's problems. Across the Atlantic, another ship prepared for her own voyage. She was very different from Andrea Doria. The Swedish liner Stockholm lacked the Italian ship's grandeur. Smaller, simpler, and built with practicality in mind, she carried fewer passengers and emphasized efficiency over luxury. Her interiors were pleasant rather than extravagant. Travelers choosing Stockholm often valued dependable service instead of lavish surroundings. If Andrea Doria resembled a grand European hotel floating across the sea, Stockholm felt more like a comfortable, well-organized home. Neither approach was wrong. Each reflected the priorities of the nation that built it. The officers serving aboard both vessels were professionals who had spent years learning their craft. Merchant mariners trained carefully, rising through experience rather than sudden promotion. Navigation demanded patience, mathematical precision, discipline, and respect for forces beyond human control. No captain truly controlled the sea. He merely negotiated with it. During the summer of 1956, thousands of passengers boarded ships every week, trusting crews they had never met. Children explored long corridors while parents unpacked luggage. Elderly couples watched sunsets from promenade decks. Stewards memorized names. Chefs prepared elaborate meals. Musicians tuned instruments before evening performances. Life aboard an ocean liner developed its own rhythm. Morning began with sunlight reflecting from endless water. Breakfast conversations mixed different languages. Deck games occupied afternoons. Elegant dinners filled evenings. Afterward, some passengers danced beneath chandeliers while others stood quietly at the rail, watching stars appear one by one above the dark sea. Few thought much about navigation. That responsibility belonged to invisible professionals somewhere high above, on the bridge. And that was exactly how passengers preferred it. On July 17, 1956, Andrea Doria departed Genoa for New York carrying more than 1,700 passengers and crew. Families waved goodbye from crowded docks. Flags fluttered gently in the Mediterranean breeze. The engines slowly gathered strength as the great liner eased away from land. For many aboard, this journey represented more than a holiday. Some traveled toward new jobs. Others hoped to reunite with relatives they had not seen in years. Children anticipated their first glimpse of America. Movie stars and wealthy tourists expected another comfortable Atlantic crossing. Every passenger carried private hopes that had nothing to do with the ship itself. Meanwhile, Stockholm departed New York bound for Europe, carrying her own collection of travelers, dreams, conversations, and expectations. Neither voyage seemed remarkable. Thousands before them had crossed the Atlantic safely. Thousands more would follow. As Andrea Doria approached the western Atlantic several days later, weather reports indicated increasing fog near the approaches to New York Harbor. Such conditions were common. Experienced captains encountered fog regularly. It demanded caution but rarely caused panic. Still, fog possessed a strange quality unlike storms. Storms announced themselves with crashing waves and fierce winds. Fog arrived almost silently. The horizon disappeared first. Then distant ships vanished. Soon even nearby water seemed swallowed by soft gray emptiness. Sound behaved differently. A whistle echoed without revealing its source. Engines felt strangely louder while the sea itself seemed quieter. Sailors often described heavy fog as creating a world where distance became impossible to judge. Radar reduced some uncertainty. But it introduced new questions. How should officers interpret moving echoes? What assumptions could safely be made? How much trust belonged to electronic instruments, and how much belonged to instinct developed over decades? Those questions had no simple answers because radar remained relatively new. Different crews sometimes developed different habits for interpreting its information. That difference would matter more than anyone realized. Aboard Andrea Doria, Captain Piero Calamai was among Italy's most respected merchant captains. He had spent much of his life at sea. Colleagues considered him disciplined, experienced, and deeply committed to his profession. He was not reckless. He was not careless. Those who knew him described a calm man whose confidence came from experience rather than arrogance. History has sometimes reduced him to one terrible night. But before that night, he had completed countless successful voyages that attracted little attention because success rarely becomes famous. On Stockholm, Captain Harry Gunnar Nordenson had temporarily entrusted navigation during portions of the voyage to qualified officers, following common maritime practice. Young officers gained valuable experience by standing bridge watches under established procedures. No one aboard believed they were approaching history. Passengers settled into evening routines. Some finished late dinners. Others read books beneath bedside lamps. Children slept peacefully while gentle vibrations from the engines hummed through the ship's structure. Crew members continued ordinary duties. Stewards collected dishes. Engineers monitored machinery deep below the waterline. Lookouts searched the darkness ahead. Everything appeared routine. Yet somewhere beyond the fog, another ship moved steadily closer. Neither vessel could yet be seen. Neither bridge fully understood what the other believed. And beneath the calm surface of that ordinary summer evening, the quiet chain of decisions that would soon change maritime history had already begun. The Atlantic that evening seemed almost determined to hide itself. As darkness settled over the water on the night of July 25, 1956, the sea was relatively calm. There were no towering waves crashing against the hull, no violent storm bending masts, and no dramatic flashes of lightning across the horizon. To anyone standing on the open deck, it might even have felt peaceful. The air carried a cool dampness, and the gentle rise and fall of the ship gave the comforting impression that everything was exactly as it should be. Yet the greatest dangers at sea are not always loud. Sometimes they arrive wrapped in silence. The fog grew thicker as the Andrea Doria steamed toward the busy shipping lanes leading to New York. At times it was so dense that the great ship seemed to be sailing through a world made entirely of gray. The powerful lights at the bow reflected back into the mist instead of cutting through it. Beyond a short distance, there was simply nothing. Every few minutes, the mournful blast of the ship's whistle rolled across the Atlantic. It echoed into emptiness. Somewhere far away, another whistle answered. The sound was haunting. For sailors, it was also a reminder that they were not alone. On the bridge of the Andrea Doria, Captain Piero Calamai and his officers carefully watched both the sea ahead and the glowing radar display. Radar had become one of the most important tools aboard modern ships, but it was still only a tool. It did not make decisions. Human beings still had to interpret the information it provided. Small glowing marks appeared on the screen. Most represented distant vessels. Others slowly disappeared. One particular echo, however, began drawing more attention than the others. Another ship. Still several miles away. Still hidden inside the fog. At first, there was little reason for concern. Ocean liners passed one another every day. The Atlantic was enormous, and experienced navigators routinely adjusted course to ensure safe passing distances. Everything suggested that this encounter would be no different. But beneath that appearance of normality, two separate bridges were beginning to build two completely different pictures of the same situation. And that was where the danger truly began. Aboard the Swedish liner Stockholm, the officers also detected the Italian ship on radar. Like their counterparts aboard Andrea Doria, they believed they understood the approaching vessel's position and intended course. The problem was not that either crew failed to notice the other. The problem was that each believed the other ship would pass on a different side. It sounds almost impossible. Two professional crews. Two modern ships. Two radar systems. Yet each bridge interpreted the developing situation differently. Historians have spent decades studying exactly why. According to later investigations, differences in radar interpretation, assumptions about relative movement, and human judgment combined in ways that nobody fully recognized until it was too late. Neither bridge believed a collision was likely. Each believed the other ship would continue making a predictable maneuver. Neither realized those expectations were quietly pulling both vessels toward the very point they hoped to avoid. It is one of history's most unsettling lessons. Sometimes disaster does not happen because someone sees nothing. It happens because everyone believes they already understand what they are seeing. Meanwhile, life below deck continued almost untouched by these invisible calculations. In the first-class dining room, elegant dinners had only recently ended. Glasses had been cleared from polished tables. Stewards chatted quietly while preparing for breakfast the following morning. Some passengers gathered in lounges where soft music floated through richly decorated rooms. Others stepped outside for a breath of cool night air before returning to comfortable cabins. Children slept beneath neatly folded blankets. Couples spoke softly about what they hoped to do after arriving in New York. Some people were writing postcards. Others were reading novels beneath bedside lamps. No one imagined that within minutes those same corridors would fill with frightened voices. No one knew that many of the carefully packed suitcases would never again be opened. Above them, however, tension was slowly increasing. The radar echoes drew closer. Distance continued shrinking. Bridge officers recalculated. Orders were discussed. The whistles continued sounding into the fog. Each blast disappeared into the darkness before returning as a faint echo. The sea itself offered almost no visual clues. Only instruments. Only assumptions. Only experience. Captain Calamai remained focused. He had spent decades making exactly these kinds of navigational decisions. His officers trusted his judgment. Across the water, the officers aboard Stockholm trusted their own calculations just as completely. Neither crew considered themselves reckless. Neither believed they were making extraordinary decisions. That is often how history unfolds. The choices that become famous rarely feel historic in the moment they are made. For a while, everything still seemed manageable. Then came the first unmistakable sign that something was wrong. Out of the fog, lights suddenly appeared. Not faint. Not distant. Close. Far closer than anyone expected. On both bridges, the realization arrived almost simultaneously. The ships were not passing safely. They were heading almost directly toward one another. The calm routine of navigation instantly became a desperate race against time. Orders rang across both bridges. Helmsmen turned their wheels. Engine commands were shouted. Men who had spent years training for emergencies suddenly found themselves living one. The massive ships responded. But ships of that size cannot pivot like small boats. Momentum has its own stubborn logic. Thousands of tons of steel continued moving forward. Every second mattered. The fog left almost no room for correction. On Andrea Doria, Captain Calamai ordered evasive action. Across the water, Stockholm also turned. Each crew hoped the other ship was doing exactly what they expected. Instead, the final movements brought the vessels even closer together. The distance collapsed. Hundreds of feet. Then less. Passengers standing near windows suddenly noticed bright lights where there should have been only darkness. Some later remembered seeing another enormous ship emerging almost like a ghost. Others recalled only confusion. There was barely time to react. At approximately 11:10 p.m., the bow of Stockholm slammed into the starboard side of Andrea Doria. The impact was terrifying. Steel screamed against steel. The sound echoed throughout both ships like thunder trapped inside metal walls. People were thrown from beds. Books flew from shelves. Glass shattered across dining rooms. Light fixtures swung violently overhead. Furniture slid across polished floors. Many passengers believed they had struck an underwater rock. Others thought an explosion had occurred. The force of the collision tore a massive opening into Andrea Doria's side. The reinforced ice-breaking bow of Stockholm acted almost like a giant blade. It penetrated deep into the Italian liner before finally pulling free. Cold Atlantic water immediately rushed into damaged compartments. Not in a trickle. Not gradually. With overwhelming force. Below the waterline, crew members heard the terrifying roar of flooding. Engineers rushed through narrowing passages as seawater surged into spaces that only moments earlier had contained machinery and electrical systems. Doors were closed. Damage reports began arriving. Each new message sounded worse than the last. The ship quickly developed a list to starboard. At first it seemed manageable. Then the angle slowly increased. Captain Calamai immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. The damage was far greater than anyone had hoped. Several watertight compartments had flooded. Even more dangerously, the ship had been designed with assumptions about how flooding would occur. The collision had created circumstances those assumptions did not fully anticipate. As water poured into one side of the ship, balance disappeared. The list continued growing. And that single detail would soon create another crisis. Many of the lifeboats on the port side became increasingly difficult to launch because they hung high above the water as the ship leaned farther and farther to starboard. The very equipment designed to save lives was becoming unusable. Yet remarkably, panic did not immediately spread. Crew members moved quickly through passageways. Passengers were awakened. Life jackets were distributed. Announcements encouraged calm. Many people still believed the situation would soon come under control. After all, this was one of the world's newest and safest passenger liners. Surely she could not sink. But beneath everyone's feet, the Atlantic kept pouring inside. And with every passing minute, the beautiful Andrea Doria leaned a little farther toward the sea. The hardest part of the night was only beginning. In the darkness around the damaged liner, rescue ships were already changing course, racing through the fog toward a disaster they could not yet see. And before dawn arrived, thousands of ordinary people would witness one of the greatest sea rescues ever carried out in peacetime. The first thing many passengers noticed was not fear. It was silence. After the terrible grinding sound of steel against steel had faded into the fog, an almost unsettling stillness settled over the Andrea Doria. The engines slowed. The familiar vibration that had gently carried the ship across the Atlantic for days began to disappear. In its place came something far more troubling, the distant rush of seawater flooding compartments deep below, the echo of hurried footsteps on polished decks, and the quiet realization that the great liner was no longer standing level beneath their feet. People instinctively reached for walls, handrails, and furniture. The ship was leaning. Not dramatically at first. Just enough for a glass to slide slowly across a table, or for a hanging lamp to sway at an unusual angle. But every passing minute made the list more noticeable. Passengers opened cabin doors and found hallways strangely tilted. Shoes slipped across carpets. Suitcases rolled against walls. Water in sinks no longer rested evenly. It was a subtle change. But it carried enormous meaning. Captain Piero Calamai quickly gathered reports from every part of the ship. None of them were encouraging. The collision had ripped a massive opening into the starboard side, flooding multiple compartments. Water poured in faster than pumps could remove it. Engineers fought to contain the damage, but they knew the mathematics of buoyancy could not be negotiated. The sea was patient. And it was winning. For a brief moment, there remained a fragile hope. Perhaps the flooding could be controlled. Perhaps the list would stabilize. Perhaps the ship could remain afloat long enough to reach shallow water or receive assistance. But with every new report from below deck, those hopes became more difficult to believe. The Andrea Doria had survived the collision. Whether she could survive the next several hours was another question entirely. Captain Calamai faced one of the heaviest decisions any captain can make. Ordering passengers into lifeboats too early could create unnecessary panic. Waiting too long could become fatal. There was no perfect answer. Only responsibility. History often remembers captains for a single decision, but rarely captures the loneliness behind it. He understood that thousands of lives now depended upon calm judgment made under extraordinary pressure. Meanwhile, aboard the Stockholm, the situation looked very different. The Swedish ship had suffered severe damage to her bow. Steel plates had folded inward, cabins at the front of the vessel were crushed, and several crew members and passengers had been injured. Yet despite the destruction, the ship remained stable. She could still float. Her captain immediately recognized that the Italian liner had suffered far worse. Without hesitation, the Stockholm transformed from collision partner into rescue ship. That distinction mattered. Within minutes, radio operators aboard both vessels sent urgent distress calls into the night. Their signals spread rapidly across the Atlantic. Nearby ships answered. Coast Guard stations responded. Radio rooms hundreds of miles away suddenly became filled with tense voices exchanging coordinates, weather conditions, and rescue plans. The quiet Atlantic night had become the center of an international emergency. One vessel in particular would soon play a remarkable role. The French ocean liner Ile de France was sailing not far away. When her captain received the distress message, there was almost no hesitation. The great liner altered course immediately and headed toward the damaged ships at full speed. Other vessels did the same. Cargo ships. Passenger liners. Coast Guard cutters. Every available ship capable of helping began moving toward the same point hidden inside the fog. It became a race against time. Back aboard the Andrea Doria, crew members moved from cabin to cabin helping frightened passengers put on life jackets. Many travelers remained surprisingly calm. Some believed they would return after a short evacuation. Others carefully packed small bags, assuming their luggage would be recovered later. Children clutched stuffed animals and blankets. Parents tried to smile. Crew members offered reassuring words even when they themselves were uncertain. That quiet courage deserves to be remembered. History often celebrates dramatic heroes. But many acts of bravery happen without speeches, applause, or recognition. A steward calmly guiding elderly passengers through dark hallways. An engineer remaining below deck to monitor flooding. A nurse comforting injured strangers she had never met. A radio operator refusing to leave his station until every message had been sent. These people rarely become famous. Yet without them, far more lives might have been lost. The growing list of the ship soon created a dangerous complication. The lifeboats on the port side, the side opposite the collision, were now hanging so high above the water that many could not be safely lowered. This was one of the greatest weaknesses revealed by the disaster. The Andrea Doria carried enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. But because of the severe angle of the ship, nearly half of them had become almost impossible to use. The sea had exposed a flaw that designers had never fully anticipated. Fortunately, help was already approaching. The Stockholm, despite her damaged bow, maneuvered carefully alongside the stricken liner. It was an extraordinary sight. Only a short time earlier, the two ships had collided in tragedy. Now they worked together to save lives. Lifeboats from the Stockholm crossed repeatedly between the vessels, carrying passengers away from the leaning Italian liner. Soon, additional rescue boats from the arriving ships joined the effort. The evacuation became one of the largest and most successful maritime rescues of its era. The fog that had hidden danger now concealed an armada of rescuers moving carefully through the darkness. Searchlights swept across the water. Whistles echoed from every direction. Voices called instructions across the waves. The Atlantic, so quiet only hours before, had become alive with determined purpose. For many passengers, boarding a lifeboat was the most frightening moment of the night. Looking back toward the Andrea Doria, they could see her elegant profile slowly tilting farther toward the sea. The rows of illuminated windows no longer appeared straight. The magnificent decks where they had walked only that afternoon now leaned at impossible angles. It was difficult to accept. A ship so large seemed almost incapable of sinking. Yet nature does not measure beauty. Nor does it spare greatness. Among the evacuees were infants carried carefully through the darkness, elderly travelers supported by complete strangers, newly married couples who had boarded the voyage with dreams of a new life, and crew members who refused to leave until their duties were complete. Some passengers later remembered remarkable acts of kindness. People shared blankets. Parents comforted children who were not their own. Sailors risked their safety to help those trapped by the steeply sloping corridors. In moments of crisis, ordinary people often reveal extraordinary character. As dawn slowly approached, the list continued increasing. Captain Calamai remained aboard. Like many captains before him, he believed his responsibility ended only when everyone else had been given every possible chance to survive. He walked the decks one final time. Reports confirmed that nearly all passengers had been evacuated. The once lively ship had become strangely empty. Cabins stood open. Dining rooms sat abandoned. Half-finished cups of coffee remained on tables. Books rested where readers had left them. The elegant liner that had represented Italy's post-war hope had become a silent shell drifting on the Atlantic. Shortly after sunrise on July 26, the end finally came. For hours, the Andrea Doria had fought against the sea. Now the struggle was over. The list became steeper. Water reached higher decks. The stern slowly lifted. Then, with astonishing grace for a ship in her final moments, the great liner rolled onto her side. She lingered there briefly, almost as though unwilling to disappear. Then she slipped beneath the surface. The Atlantic closed quietly above her. There was no great explosion. No towering wave. Only widening circles spreading across calm water where one of the world's finest passenger liners had floated only hours before. She had been at sea for less than 5 years. The loss was heartbreaking. Yet amid the tragedy, there was something remarkable. Of the more than 1,700 passengers and crew aboard the Andrea Doria, the overwhelming majority survived thanks to the swift rescue effort. Although 46 people aboard the Italian liner and 5 aboard the Stockholm lost their lives, the disaster could easily have claimed hundreds more. It remains one of the greatest peacetime sea rescues ever accomplished. But saving lives was only the beginning. As rescue ships steamed toward New York carrying exhausted survivors, another journey was about to begin. Not across the Atlantic. But through testimony, evidence, radar records, ship designs, courtroom arguments, and decades of historical debate. The world wanted a simple answer. Who had made the fatal mistake? Was it the officers aboard the Andrea Doria? Was it the crew of the Stockholm? Or was the truth, like the fog that surrounded both ships that night, far more complicated? That is where our story now turns. The sea had claimed the ship, but it had not buried the questions. Those questions would echo through maritime history for generations, and understanding them requires looking beyond blame and into the complex nature of human judgment itself. When the last survivors reached New York, many of them expected the hardest part of the story to be over. They were wrong. The cold Atlantic had already taken the Andrea Doria, but it had left behind something far more difficult to settle than the fate of a ship. It had left questions. Newspapers wanted names. Governments wanted explanations. Shipping companies wanted to protect their reputations. Families wanted to know why a modern luxury liner, equipped with advanced technology and commanded by experienced officers, had disappeared beneath the sea after a collision that, at least on paper, should never have happened. Almost immediately, the search for someone to blame began. That was understandable. Human beings are uncomfortable with uncertainty. When tragedy strikes, we instinctively look for a single mistake, a single person, a single decision that explains everything. It feels reassuring to believe disasters have simple causes because simple causes suggest simple solutions. But history rarely offers that comfort. The story of the Andrea Doria would become one of the clearest examples of how several small errors, each understandable on its own, can combine into one irreversible catastrophe. In the days after the sinking, newspapers across Europe and America filled their front pages with dramatic photographs. The images were unforgettable. There was the wounded bow of the Stockholm, its steel crushed inward like folded paper. There were photographs of exhausted survivors wrapped in blankets after reaching New York. And there were the now famous pictures taken from aircraft, showing the Andrea Doria lying helplessly on her side before finally slipping beneath the Atlantic. For millions of readers, these photographs transformed an accident into a symbol. The ship quickly became known as the Italian Titanic. It was a dramatic comparison. But it was also misleading. The two disasters shared obvious similarities. Both involved famous passenger liners. Both occurred in the North Atlantic. Both shocked the public. Yet beyond those surface details, the stories were remarkably different. The Titanic struck an iceberg in an era when lifeboats were dangerously insufficient and radio communication was still developing. The Andrea Doria, by contrast, carried enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, benefited from international radio coordination, and was surrounded by ships capable of mounting an extraordinary rescue. Technology had saved hundreds of lives. Yet technology had also played a role in creating the disaster. That contradiction fascinated investigators. To understand why, they had to reconstruct the final minutes before the collision almost second by second. Every radar reading mattered. Every course change mattered. Every whistle signal mattered. Every order spoken on each bridge became part of a puzzle. Investigators interviewed officers, crew members, passengers, rescue personnel, and navigation experts. Charts were examined. Weather reports were compared. Ship logs were studied line by line. Radar specialists attempted to understand exactly what each bridge had seen, or believed they had seen, through the fog. One conclusion became clear rather quickly. Neither captain had intended to take reckless risks. Captain Piero Calamai had an excellent professional reputation. So did Captain Harry Gunnar Nordenson of the Stockholm. Neither man began that evening expecting history to remember his name. And yet history often places ordinary people into extraordinary moments. The official investigation suggested that both ships had contributed to the collision through a combination of navigational decisions and misunderstandings. But that conclusion satisfied almost no one. Supporters of the Italian crew believed the Swedish officers had misread their radar and altered course incorrectly. Supporters of the Swedish crew argued that the Andrea Doria had been traveling too fast for conditions and had also misunderstood the developing situation. For years, each version found defenders. Courtrooms prepared. Lawyers gathered evidence. Experts disagreed. Maritime journals published competing analyses. The debate stretched far beyond the Atlantic. It reached universities, navigation schools, engineering conferences, and naval academies around the world. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting. As radar technology improved over the following decades, historians and navigation experts returned to the case with fresh eyes. Modern computer simulations allowed researchers to reconstruct the movements of both ships with remarkable accuracy. What they found suggested that the disaster had not been caused by one catastrophic mistake. Instead, it had emerged from several smaller ones. The Andrea Doria appears to have maintained a relatively high speed despite entering dense fog. Although slowing was common practice under such conditions, experienced captains sometimes balanced caution against the practical realities of commercial schedules and confidence in modern navigation equipment. Whether Captain Calamai should have reduced speed even further remains a subject of discussion, but many historians believe it would have provided valuable additional time to assess the developing situation. At the same time, evidence suggested that the officers aboard the Stockholm may have misinterpreted the radar display, leading them to believe the Italian liner would safely pass on the opposite side. It was not that radar had failed. It was that people had interpreted the information differently. Technology can provide data. It cannot eliminate human judgment. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was in 1956. Researchers also examined another important factor. Both bridges relied heavily on expectations. Each crew believed the other ship would continue making a certain maneuver. Instead of immediately recognizing conflicting assumptions, both vessels continued adjusting based on what they expected the other to do. The result was tragic. It was almost as though two people walking toward one another in a crowded hallway both stepped in the same direction at exactly the same moment. Except here, the hallway was the Atlantic Ocean, and each step involved thousands of tons of moving steel. Another revelation emerged regarding the ship herself. The Andrea Doria had been praised for her safety features, including multiple watertight compartments. Those systems worked largely as designed. The problem lay elsewhere. When flooding caused the severe list to starboard, fuel tanks on the opposite side, which were intended to help maintain stability, contained less seawater ballast than designers had anticipated during emergency calculations. As the ship leaned farther over, the imbalance worsened. This increasing angle made half the lifeboats almost impossible to launch. It was a painful reminder that safety systems are often tested in ways their designers never fully imagined. Following the disaster, naval architects carefully studied these weaknesses. Ship stability standards evolved. Training procedures improved. Radar instruction became far more standardized. Bridge communication protocols were strengthened. International maritime organizations emphasized clearer procedures for operating in restricted visibility. In other words, the Andrea Doria continued saving lives long after she had sunk. Not through her survival, but through the lessons she forced the world to learn. Captain Calamai never fully recovered emotionally from the disaster. Although many later studies acknowledged the complexity of the collision, he reportedly carried a profound sense of personal responsibility for the rest of his life. Friends described him as deeply affected. Like many professional mariners, he believed that the captain ultimately bore responsibility for everything that happened aboard his ship, regardless of how many factors had contributed. It was a heavy burden. One that cannot easily be measured by official reports. History sometimes forgets that investigations eventually end. Human memory does not. Today, the Andrea Doria rests more than 240 feet beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Divers often refer to her as one of the most challenging and dangerous shipwrecks in the world. Strong currents, poor visibility, collapsing structures, and decades of deterioration have claimed the lives of experienced wreck divers who attempted to explore her remains. Even in silence, the ship continues to command respect. She has become both a historical site and a maritime memorial. The elegant dining rooms are gone. The polished decks have disappeared beneath layers of marine life. The chandeliers that once reflected laughter now rest in darkness. Yet the story has never truly faded. Books continue to be written. Documentaries continue to revisit the collision. Maritime students still analyze the decisions made that foggy July night. Because the question that began our journey tonight remains surprisingly difficult to answer. Who was really to blame? Perhaps the most honest answer is also the least satisfying. No single person. No single mistake. The disaster grew from confidence, assumptions, incomplete information, limited technology, difficult weather, and human beings making decisions under immense pressure. Each individual choice appeared reasonable in isolation. Together, they became irreversible. History is full of moments like that. Empires have fallen not because of one decision, but because of many. Wars have begun through misunderstandings that seemed insignificant at first. Lives have changed because ordinary people believed they still had one more minute. The Andrea Doria reminds us that wisdom is often found not in certainty, but in humility. It reminds us that experience is invaluable, yet never infallible. It reminds us that technology is powerful, but it cannot replace careful judgment. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that behind every famous disaster are ordinary people who woke expecting an ordinary day. As the Atlantic continues its endless rhythm above the wreck, few signs remain on the surface to suggest that one of the 20th century's most famous ocean liners lies below. Ships still cross those waters. Fog still forms without warning. Whistles still echo through the night. The sea remembers, even when the world moves on. And if you're still awake, thank you for spending part of your evening exploring this remarkable chapter of history with me. I hope this quiet voyage has offered not only answers, but also a deeper appreciation for how fragile certainty can be. There are countless more stories waiting beyond the horizon, hidden in old maps, forgotten journals, and silent ruins. But for tonight, let the ocean grow calm once more, let the questions drift gently into the distance, and let the night carry you peacefully toward rest. The story of the Andrea Doria did not end when she disappeared beneath the Atlantic. In many ways, that quiet moment marked the beginning of another journey, one that would unfold not on the open sea, but in memory. While the wreck slowly became part of the ocean floor, the people who had sailed aboard her carried the voyage with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke about it often. Others almost never mentioned it. Yet nearly all of them remembered small details with remarkable clarity. A child's toy left behind in a cabin. The smell of fresh coffee only minutes before the collision. The strange angle of a hallway that had always been perfectly level. The sound of shoes sliding across polished floors. History is often told through grand events, but memory tends to preserve the smallest moments. Years passed, and survivors grew older. Many returned to ordinary lives. Children who had been carried into lifeboats became adults with families of their own. Crew members found work on other ships, though few ever forgot the night when routine suddenly gave way to uncertainty. Some reunited at anniversaries of the disaster, sharing photographs and stories that no official report could ever fully capture. There was gratitude, certainly. But there was also quiet sadness. Because survival and loss can exist together. Many survivors later said that what stayed with them most was not the collision itself, but the extraordinary kindness they witnessed afterward. Complete strangers offered blankets, shared food, comforted frightened children, and welcomed exhausted passengers aboard rescue ships without asking who they were or where they had come from. In the middle of disaster, humanity had revealed one of its better qualities. That deserves to be remembered just as much as the mistakes. As decades passed, the Andrea Doria gradually became one of the world's most famous shipwrecks. Unlike many wrecks that remain largely untouched, her location was known. Resting in relatively accessible waters off the coast of Massachusetts, she attracted experienced wreck divers from around the world. To them, the ship represented the ultimate challenge. But the Atlantic had not become gentler. Powerful currents swept across the wreck. Visibility often disappeared into darkness. Fishing nets became tangled around twisted steel. As the ship slowly deteriorated, walls collapsed, passageways narrowed, and familiar layouts changed year by year. Several highly skilled divers lost their lives while exploring the wreck. For that reason, many in the diving community speak of the Andrea Doria with deep respect rather than excitement. She is not simply an underwater destination. She is a place where history, nature, and human ambition meet in fragile balance. Even now, the ocean continues to reshape her. Rust slowly consumes steel. Wood disappears. Marine life claims spaces once filled with conversation and music. Time, both above and below the surface, keeps moving. And still, the questions remain fascinating. Could the collision have been avoided if either ship had reduced speed sooner? Would today's navigation systems have prevented the misunderstanding? How much responsibility belongs to technology, and how much belongs to the people using it? These are not merely historical questions. Modern bridge officers, airline pilots, engineers, doctors, and countless other professionals continue to face similar challenges every day. Advanced technology provides remarkable information, but human judgment remains essential. The Andrea Doria reminds us that progress does not eliminate the need for humility. Sometimes it increases it. Perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate nearly 70 years later. It is not simply about a beautiful ship. It is about trust. Trust in experience. Trust in instruments. Trust in other people making decisions beyond our sight. And sometimes, those forms of trust collide. History has a habit of turning complex events into simple stories. Heroes become flawless. Villains become obvious. Tragedies become neat lessons with clear endings. The real past is rarely so tidy. Captain Piero Calamai was neither a reckless fool nor an infallible master of the sea. The officers aboard the Stockholm were neither careless villains nor perfect navigators. The engineers who designed the ship worked with the best knowledge available at the time. The rescuers who answered the distress calls demonstrated extraordinary courage. Every person involved was, in the end, exactly what history so often forgets they were. Human. Doing their best inside circumstances they could not completely control. That may be the most important lesson the Andrea Doria leaves behind. Not that people make mistakes. We already know that. But that history's greatest disasters often emerge when several reasonable decisions quietly reinforce one another until there is no longer enough time to change course. It is a lesson that reaches far beyond the sea. As you picture the Atlantic tonight, imagine it once more at peace. The fog has lifted. Morning sunlight stretches across calm water. Ships continue their journeys toward distant ports. Passengers lean against railings, watching gulls circle overhead. Few think about the liner resting far below. Yet beneath those waves, hidden in cold blue silence, the Andrea Doria remains exactly where she came to rest in July of 1956, a quiet reminder that every voyage carries both confidence and uncertainty, and that the line between ordinary routine and extraordinary history can sometimes be measured in only a few minutes. If you've stayed with me until the end of this journey, thank you for sharing these quiet hours of history. I hope this story has offered not just the details of a famous maritime disaster, but a deeper appreciation for the people who lived through it and the lessons they unknowingly left behind. There will always be another forgotten kingdom, another lonely lighthouse, another ancient road, another ship crossing another sea, waiting to tell its story. But for now, let the waves grow still in your imagination. Let the fog drift away. Let the unanswered questions settle gently into history. And wherever you are listening tonight, may the rest of your evening be peaceful, your thoughts unhurried, and your sleep as calm as the Atlantic looked before that quiet summer night changed everything. As the years became decades, the story of the Andrea Doria quietly crossed an invisible line. It was no longer simply a news event remembered by those who had lived through it. It became history. The kind of history that teachers mention briefly, that museum exhibit summarize in a few photographs, and that maritime students revisit again and again, not because the answers are easy, but because they are not. Every generation has looked at the collision through the lens of its own technology. In the 1950s, radar itself seemed astonishingly modern. It represented a future in which ships could see through darkness and fog. Yet after the disaster, many realized that new technology often creates new responsibilities rather than removing old ones. By the 1970s and 1980s, navigational systems had become more sophisticated. Training improved. Bridge resource management, encouraging officers to question assumptions and communicate more openly, became a far greater priority. In the 21st century, commercial vessels travel with GPS, electronic charts, automatic identification systems, advanced radar integration, satellite communications, and computer-assisted navigation that Captain Calamai could scarcely have imagined. Even so, experienced captains continue to teach one lesson above all others. Never assume. Confirm. Because the ocean has not changed. Fog still forms. Equipment can still be misunderstood. People can still become too confident. The Andrea Doria remains one of the clearest reminders that technology is most effective when paired with patience, discipline, and humility. There is another reason this story continues to endure. Unlike many famous disasters, it is also a story of remarkable success. That may sound surprising at first. After all, a magnificent ocean liner was lost. 51 people never returned home. Families mourned fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, friends, and colleagues. Nothing can erase that tragedy. And yet, when historians compare the scale of the collision with the number of lives ultimately saved, the rescue stands as one of the greatest achievements in maritime history. Ships answered the distress call without hesitation. Crews worked together despite language barriers and national differences. Rival companies forgot competition. Professional pride gave way to shared humanity. On that dark Atlantic night, the sea separated nations, but compassion united them. It is worth remembering that part of the story as carefully as we remember the collision itself. History often focuses on disasters. It sometimes overlooks kindness. And kindness deserves its own place in the record. Today, if you visit museums dedicated to maritime history, you may find elegant photographs of the Andrea Doria during her brief years of service. She appears almost impossibly graceful. Her sleek white hull gleams in the sunlight. Passengers smile from open decks. Italian flags flutter proudly above polished railings. Nothing in those photographs suggests that the ship would spend most of her existence beneath the sea rather than upon it. There is something quietly moving about that contrast. The ship sailed for less than 5 years. Yet people have been telling her story for nearly 70. Sometimes the length of a life matters less than the meaning it leaves behind. If you could somehow stand above the wreck today, the Atlantic would reveal almost nothing. The surface rises and falls as it always has. Fishing boats pass. Commercial ships continue toward New York. The wind carries the same salt air. Seabirds glide overhead. Only the charts, and the memories of those who know where to look, mark the place where one of history's most famous ocean liners came to rest. The sea keeps its secrets well. But not completely. Because every generation returns to this story, asking the same quiet question. Could it have been different? The honest answer is almost certainly yes. A slightly slower speed. A different interpretation of a radar screen. One earlier course correction. One clearer exchange of intentions. A few more moments of hesitation. History often turns on changes so small they seem almost invisible until viewed in hindsight. Yet hindsight is a luxury unavailable to those living the moment. Captain Calamai did not know he was making history. Neither did the officers aboard the Stockholm. Neither did the families finishing dinner, the children already asleep, the engineers below deck, or the radio operators sending routine messages into the night. They were simply living another ordinary evening. History arrived without announcing itself. Perhaps that is the final lesson the Andrea Doria offers. The moments that shape the future rarely feel extraordinary while we are inside them. They feel ordinary. Until they are not. And so, as our voyage through this chapter of maritime history comes gently